Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Exercise is Bullshit. I'm so excited to be joined today by Master Max Coleman, I guess we could call you, soon to be hopefully PhD. Obviously, we like to use acronyms on this show. So today we might be dusting off an old one, but we're going to be bros utilizing logical lifting and science-based heuristics to inform our training. So Max, thank you so much for joining me today. Please introduce yourself. Tell everyone a little bit about you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's an incredible acronym for bullshit. That's so well done. It seemed like on the spot too. That was awesome. I guess you guys probably don't care about what my favorite type of sushi is. So I'll talk about the stuff that's probably relevant to what you
I like sushi, so that's acceptable.
Okay. Well, unagi, like a nice little unagi, some eel sushi.
Is that eel? Okay.
Yeah. But with respect to exercises, bullshit. I just like you were saying, graduated with my master's in May under Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, and anyone who's in the game of evidence-based fitness knows that Brad Schoenfeld is kind of the real top guy as far as hypertrophy-based research is concerned. And I'm by no means calling myself top guy as far as hypertrophy research is concerned, but I just had the pleasure.
He's coming for you, Brad. He's coming for you.
I had the pleasure of working under him and kind of was always interested in exercise-based research, and over the last 2 years really honed in my focus to kind of what he's interested in, which is how can we manipulate training variables to make people as jacked as possible, essentially. That's basically what my primary research interest is. But I've been in the game far longer than the academic side. So I started lifting when I was about 12 years old and kind of fell in love with it immediately for the same reason that everyone starts lifting. It just wanted to look like Hugh Jackman and just kind of stuck with it from there. And then sometime around 18 or 19 years old, I kind of found the more evidence-based side of people like Eric Helms, Dr. Mike Israetel, Greg Nichols, and all them. And that kind of really started pointing me in the direction of, oh, this is something that you can actually do for a career, which just kind of, led me to where I am. Hopefully that's good enough of an introduction of what I do.
That's a great introduction. And I love Israetel. I'm hoping to actually contact him at some point to get him on the show. So Dr. Mike, if you're listening, I'd love to get you on. Maybe you can even throw in a good word for me. I think he helps out at Lehman from time to time, correct?
Yeah. So he's an adjunct instructor here. He teaches various courses at the master's level, and he funded my thesis.
Oh, so, that's awesome. Yeah.
So he's a helpful guy. Sure.
So funny side note too, my fiance is obsessed with the Renaissance Periodization app, and she has stopped listening to anything I do from a content perspective and basically only tells me about Mike's podcast. I know it's Mike and I'm blanking on the other guy's name.
Brian Shaw. We're not Brian Shaw.
Nick Shaw. Yeah, no, they're hilarious and I love their stuff. But it's like, come on, babe, can you listen to something that I do? Anyways, neither here nor there. So working out of Lehman, you got your undergrad and your graduate degree there, and it sounds like maybe there's going to be a PhD in the future. Is that something you're still thinking about pursuing?
Absolutely. So fingers crossed. So Lehman is definitely getting a PhD program in their human performance and fitness school. However, when is more so the question. So hopefully starting in the fall of 2024 or the spring of 2025, that program will actually open up and I can actually start pursuing my PhD once.
Well, you're still a young buck. I'm sure Dr. Schoenfeld would tell you that, he didn't get his PhD, I think, until he was in his late 30s, early 40s. So yeah, plenty of time. So plenty of time to keep learning. That's awesome. And you've got so many colleagues, people I've talked to that have been part of that Lehman Science Lab that have gone on to be currently studying for their PhDs under some other really great research labs in the country. So it's, for those of you who aren't familiar with Lehman College, it's a small, school in New York, but they're doing some of the best research in the country when it comes to, probably in the world, when it comes to exercise science. So super cool to be part of that. Now, how many studies have you currently been a part of now? I was looking up your research gate and it's starting to get a little stacked there. I saw maybe 14. Does that sound right?
So 14, some of those are in preprint. Some of them are just reviews, right? So things like narrative reviews, systematic analyses and stuff like that. But we did just hit 15, fortunately, because of the really cool paper that Dr. Pack led with respect to optimizing a resistance training technique for the purposes of. So that made 15, put a nice little cherry on top of my last 2 years, which was nice. So yeah, 15. That's
Is
nice of you
that,
to say.
yeah, that's awesome. Is that paper still in the works? Is that in preprint or is it? I talked
Yep,
to Pac
also
about
in
this
pre-
recently, but it sounded like it was okay. Awesome. Yeah, I'm super excited to hear about that one. Okay, so what are you doing currently? Right. So are you coaching in the meantime? Are you teaching? What does your day-to-day look like now that you've gotten your master's degree and all those things?
Yeah, so I would say I'm in the hustle portion of my career, where kind of in a gap year between master's and PhD, so kind of just trying to stay afloat in New York City until that program opens up. So I'm fortunate enough to teach a couple classes here at Lehman College. So I teach exercise and testing prescription for both the undergrad and graduate level. I'm the lab technician here as well, so I get to stay involved in research, which is really nice. And we just wrapped another study, which is going to be really cool. So hopefully, study on the podcast here soon. But I also get to work with Jeremy Etier, who's a pretty popular YouTuber. I work for his company, Deload Science, where I just act as a science advisor. And then, yeah, some personal training and online coaching as well, based in New York City. So that's I got my foot in a couple camps right now, but that's what I'm planning on doing for the following year. Sure.
Nice, very cool. And then hopefully they let you just like rent a broom closet or something for 2000 a month in Lehman. So what is your kind of hope with your PhD once you do actually pursue that? You mentioned getting people as jacked as possible. What does that actually look like from an exercise science perspective? What do you maybe hope to? And obviously this can change, in the next year and a half by the time this program comes around. But what would you hope to actually get your degree in and focus your dissertation on?
Yeah, so the PhD would be in the same thing that I got my master's in, which the name is fuzzy. I always forget. I don't even really know what my bachelor's is in. It's in kinesiology and teaching.
I think it's
Something like
human
that.
performance. Oh, okay.
So the master's program, yeah, it's like human performance and fitness, I believe, is the title. As far as the focus is going to be the same, and I don't see that changing in perpetuity. So how can we manipulate either resistance training variables or dietary variables to elicit a more jacked individual, right? So I'm interested in, like, for instance, deload times and is continuing to test that, but also interested in, like, hey, is essential amino acids, are those just as valuable or as effective as whole protein? So regardless of if it's dietary or training, something that has to do with making people as jacked as possible. And with respect to the dissertation, I have nothing but ideas as far as right now is concerned. There's like a bunch of different areas that I'd like to delve into, but that's going to take a little bit more forethought before I can say definitively what I want to do.
Yeah, and thankfully you have some great advisors there and stuff that you can work with as well, and I help you hone that. So I love to ask the guests on this show something before we dive into your own training, because I'd like to hear, somebody who's focused on getting as jacked as possible. How does one do that? What do you do personally? But before we dive into that, I love the idea of this scientific mindset and really being open. And I think it was Dr. Mike or maybe even Brad posted something recently about. Sort of cutting down Dr. Joel Seedman, who I don't know if you're familiar with or if our listeners are familiar with. You're nodding your head like kind of a clown in the industry and does some pretty ridiculous stuff. But I enjoyed Dr. Brad's post, just simply being like, you're not following what the research actually says, right? You're just using this umbrella of I'm a scientist to basically make yourself look more important. What is something that you've sort of taken that scientific mindset on that maybe you were really sure when you were 18, 19, 20 years old that you've taken a 180-degree turn on and really don't think that the science supports it anymore? Or maybe just personally, professionally, something that you've taken a big turn on in the last, say, 1 to 5 years?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question, man. And in fact, I was just throwing around podcast ideas with my buddy Danny Boy, who we built a science podcast together about things that we've done, like a whole topic of an episode, things we've changed in several years. And so I could run down the rigmarole of like a dozen different things that I think has changed on.
Maybe 2 or 3, maybe not a
Yeah,
dozen.
yeah. Yeah. I'll stick with two. The two. Okay, so let's start with this one. Technique, right? What is good or bad form? My opinion on that has changed relatively drastically in the last just year, actually. So, for instance, are we actually confident that if I did a rounded back deadlift, right, a Jefferson curl is one, is that actually more injurious or more likely to cause an injury than a stiff-legged deadlift with a flat back or a neutral spine, right? Can we actually be confident in that? Because the data that we have would suggest, no, you cannot be confident in that whatsoever. The very limited data that we have would say that, yeah, maybe it's a little bit more injurious to place your spine under load when in kyphotic position. But that can go with just about anything, right? So not just is a rounded back deadlift, more injurious, but is a little bit of knee valgus during the squat, assuming that you expose yourself, which is knees caving in towards one another in the squat. Is that really something that is going to drastically increase your likelihood of injury, assuming that you progressively load that position over time, right? So that's one big thing, is that I don't know if I don't really often like saying, oh, that's good or bad form with respect to injury. Now, I do think that some things can be good or bad with respect to, are we actually maximizing the potential hypertrophic response from this exercise? Like, for instance, if you take knee valgus in the squat, for instance, right? That is taking some of the stress off of the quadriceps and placing it onto more ligamentous structures, right? So is it worse for hypertrophy? Probably. But can we say confidently that it's going to cause an injury? I can't say it at this point in time. And I'm not an expert. I'm not a PT, like a physical therapist, but that's just my interpretation of both the literature and what I hear actual experts talking about.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I want to hear your second thing that you've changed your mind on. But that's something I've really enjoyed seeing myself in the last few years as well. As it's so easy to poke holes in a lot of these big picture ideas from the strength and conditioning community. But periodization is one that jumps out at me. Like even long before I started training or being in this space, it was like, do we really need to periodize? Is there a point to that beyond just taking time off when you need time off or whatever it might be and maximizing outcomes? But to go into the real nuances of something like that with the J curl, for instance, it's something I didn't even really think of till right now, actually, where it's like, well, obviously you want to have a flat back, right? I've just heard that my entire lifting career. So you don't even even right now, I'm experiencing this moment of cognitive dissonance of like, oh shit, yeah, I didn't even think about that, right? That's, I'm sure, a whole area of nuance that we've not even paid attention to because it's so ingrained in lifting culture. Don't let your knees buckle together. Keep your back flat, wear a lifting belt, all those things. So super interested to see how that paper turns out and then how that field continues to develop as well. But please share your other one as well. I'd love to hear it.
No, it's the, you kind of stole my thunder there, man. My next one was going to be that with respect to hypertrophy, do we need to be having phasic approaches to training? Like, is there a reason to, with respect to muscle growth, is there any reason to believe that doing a periodized approach to training is going to elicit better adaptations? The evidence isn't there to support that. And just to be clear, like, absence of evidence does not evidence of absence. So just because we don't have any data saying that this is the case, does not necessarily mean that it is not the case, right? But given that I haven't heard like a really strong rationale for why we should be periodizing our training, right? Given that hypertrophy is a morphological adaptation, and given that we're not really trying to increase a skill of any kind, you don't get better at having bigger biceps, right? You just get bigger biceps. And I don't think that we necessarily need to have a strength phase leading into hypertrophy phase leading into or anything like that. And then, or even like low volume phases and stuff like that. Some pretty weird circumstances. Like, I just don't even, I'm just not even confident that that's something that's necessary for maximizing hypertrophy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's one of those things that just in the strength and conditioning space too has just always been, well, just because, like, that's what we do, because that's what was handed down to us by the forefathers of, big muscles, right? So, but it's so interesting to think about too, because the nuance is what really, like, the thing that upsets me about periodization, and I don't want to go off on too far of a tangent here, is it's that idea, and you see this with all kinds of charlatans within our industry, is that you have to make things more complicated than they really need to be so that you have the secret sauce, right? You're selling the magic potion. And to me, that's strength and conditioning's snake oil, is this idea of periodization, and that it needs to be some kind of progressive, like, you need an expert to help you, do these little different phases of changing things and nuances. And it's like, no, just just do stuff progressively harder over time, and you'll pretty much maximize your outcomes. Speaking of training, maximizing hypertrophy, all those things, what does your training currently look like? Because I do follow you on Instagram. I believe it's Coleman et al.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is a great follow. And you post a lot of food, and you post a lot of workouts and tonal stuff, which I'm a big fan of the tonal. I'm excited to see what happens over the next decade or so with all the different at-home exercise equipment. There's a bunch of them that I've seen now. There's Oxfit and Expedience and all these different brands. But what is your at-home training, or what does your training currently look like? How many days a week, volume sets? You can get a little specific there. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear some of the nuances.
Yeah, so my training looks, it's funny you say that. My training, I was talking to a buddy of mine yesterday who's also in the field, and I was saying, my training looks weird as fuck now. Like I said, I hope it's okay to cuss me. We complete that.
Hopefully, okay. Yeah, nope, for sure.
But it looks super weird because I'm training ultimately like hyper specifically. So I do a lot of isolation movements now, rather than trying to get like bang for buck compound movements instead. So like for instance, excuse me, yesterday I trained hip abduction. I used a hip abduction machine, right? Which is something I wouldn't have done consider like even a year ago, because I was like, you know what, whatever, like, just get hit when you do all types of squat and what have you. But then I was just thinking, if there's ever a movement that is probably neglected a little bit, there's often a movement that you're not hitting through standard patterns that you do in the gym. That's potentially muscle that you're leaving on the table, because you have specific adductors that are only involved, I think it's the I believe, I'm not sure which one, but is only involved in adduction, right? And that's potentially muscle that you're leaving on the table by not training it specifically, right? So my training, I wish I could give you a simple little, I train push-pull legs, but my training looks so weird right now. Like yesterday I did flies, hamstring, like dumbbell flies for my chest, hamstring curls, some tricep, bicep, forearm work, and then some abs as well. So just super strange. But also,
so are you breaking it up with the premise of let's hit all of these isolated body parts, but over the course of the week, as opposed to, doing a 3-hour session? Is that sort of the thinking there?
So the thinking is that I'm trying to I've been lifting since I was 12 years old, right? So I've been lifting for a larger percentage of my life than I've been living without lifting. So my lifting career is older than my lifting career, essentially. And so basically what I'm trying to do is paint in the details. Like I've built a substantial amount of muscle in the last several years, obviously, and I'm probably getting, like the genetic ceiling is obviously the lowest thing, but I'm probably a little bit closer to it than the average 25-year-old, given that I've been lifting as long as I have, right? So I'm trying to do things that, are neglected more so than not when you do traditional lifting patterns, right? So for instance, I am doing a lot of like very rounded movements for the purposes of trying to grow my erectors, right? Just because my erectors are thick as I would like, and I kind of like to increase the thickness on my back. They didn't get hit very well from doing things like stiff-legged deadlifts or RDLs, as well as like other barbell movements. So I'm starting to train that directly, right?
You guys have a MedX low back extension in the lab there?
We have, so no, not in the lab, but they have, it's the machine that you only ever see older individuals using at the gym, where it has the pad against your back and you can push against it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's the machine you're referring to, but we have one, just not,
Okay. Yeah. So sorry to cut you off,
No,
but
please.
if you do have a chance or exposure to it, just because you mentioned the erector spinae, so obviously there's like the hip extension, back extension exercises, like a Nautilus with that little pad at the back where you just kind of hinge through the hip. So the MedX low back extension specifically, and there's some modified versions of Nautilus and other companies that make it as well, but it actually fixes your femur into your hip bone. So it isolates the erectors as you actually extend. So it's a totally different experience. If you know James Fisher over in Solent University and Dr. James Steele, yes. So they have one of those in their lab. I think they have the medical version, which is like this behemoth $50,000 machine, but they make an exercise version, which if you ever get the chance to try it, it's definitely worth doing, because those muscles are extremely hard to hit, because obviously the surrounding musculature is so much stronger and kind of protected. But sorry to cut you off. Just something that
no, not at all. That's awesome, and thank you. I appreciate that. Shout out James Fisher and James Steele and Solent University.
Shout out Solent.
But yeah, so just painting in the details, like I'm doing a lot more forearm work than I would have in the past, like several years, just because I've gotten those as far. I've gotten like the lumbar spine as well as like my forearm muscles as far as they're going to go, as far as just to them the ancillary work they get from other things. So starting to paint in a little bit more specific stuff for those has been helping a lot. But to answer like the normal question, like to be like a normal person for once and answer what you actually have. I train 6 days a week. I try to do Monday through Saturday, but things always get pushed around, so you kind of have to move that around. I'm training with trying to push the volumes a little bit higher now. So we have research coming out that is suggesting that maybe more is better with respect to volume, right? So a lot of my muscle groups are just around 15, and I'm going to continue trying to get those all a little bit closer to 20, maybe even 30 for some muscle groups here soon. But over time and gradually exposing myself to those volumes, so I'm not just immediately jumping the gun with 30 sets a week per each muscle that I have.
Is that still with those smaller isolated movements as well? You're doing upwards of 15 to 20 sets of, say, like, isolated tricep extensions or bicep curls, or how is that looking for you?
Yeah, so the way that the literature has always quantified volume is, especially for the biceps and triceps, is that if you hit it, if you're doing rows, that hits your biceps and it counts on 1 set for bicep. It's not really how I count, just because it's just not how I enjoy doing it. Doesn't conceptualize well for me. So I do hit like those muscles, like my biceps and triceps, closer to like 12-ish sets per week, knowing that it's getting a lot of ancillary work from those other movements as well, which is actually kind of pushing it a little bit closer to 15, 20-ish range.
Are you tracking all of this? Like, do you have a plan when you go into the gym, or is it more of just like, okay, so you do have this sort of pre-planned out and you're following a regimented program in that sense? Gotcha.
I very much envy individuals who can just kind of go to the gym and like I was hanging out with Wolf a couple of weeks ago, and we were just hanging out one night, and I said, "Do you guys ever just look at the workout the next day and get excited, like just looking forward to the gym session?"
What workout, bro?
Pack literally went, "Tomorrow's workout's a roll of the dice, brother." Like it is like they just go in and they know what they want, they know what they need to, and they just do it, and they love training that way. And me being the weird lizard-brained, like everything in its box person that I am, I really love the numbers of it all and the making sure that I'm tracking the details of each session to the point where I'm like saying I'm using this machine at this gym today because I couldn't be at where I normally am. So just keep that in mind next time that this happens. Like I do keep more track of stuff than is absolutely necessary. Like no question about it. I don't have any of my clients track nearly to the degree that I do because I don't think it's necessary, but I just enjoy it. Like it's not a barrier for me. It's just something that I also enjoy. So yeah, I am very regimented in the way that
Yeah, I think that's some of the nuance that's important for coaches and other people as well, though, to realize that different people have different priorities and preferences. Like I'm definitely more in the pack and Milo camp than I am the over analyzing and over tracking everything. And I've gone through phases where I've not tracked for literally years at a time and just realized that, hey, if the point of training is to work as hard as I can, right, as long as I'm working with supervision and my experience, does it really matter if I'm working at 70% of 1RM or 80% of relative 1RM if I'm still taking it to failure? And from what I've seen is that the research doesn't conclusively say that, right? So in my mind, it's like, well, after you've been doing this for a while, if you kind of know what range you're in, as long as you're making sure you're pushing hard enough, should it really matter? And maybe the answer is yes, but I've not found that to be the case. I think knowing what kind of client you're working with, though, and understanding if that's something that's important to them, though, is definitely makes you a better coach, right? And realizing like, okay, this person needs to know how many sets, how many reps, if they've improved by half a pound, right? That's important to them versus, I don't care. Let's just like beat me up, man. Like that's what I came for, kind of thing. So, okay, let's dive into some of this research, Max, because two of these papers and these ideas that I want to cover with you, I think are super important. And we've talked about them before in a previous podcast, but I'd love to sort of get a rehashing and just with fresh eyes, right? It's been a while. I think the last time we talked was maybe almost a year ago. So to have this stuff in retrospect now and really be kind of done with it and moving on to other things, I'd love to talk to you first about drop sets, the paper that you published as part of your master's program. I think it was your master's, or was that for your undergrad? Master's?
No,
Okay.
Masters, yep.
Yeah. So it was the muscular adaptations in drop sets versus traditional training, and it was a meta-analysis. So it was 5 different studies, over 100 participants from those different studies. Talk to me a little bit about the paper, what it looked like, what the impetus was, and then some of the findings. What did you guys actually learn from this paper?
Yeah, so the impetus was that I was in a class where we wrote a meta-analysis for the purpose of the class. Coolest class I've ever taken in my entire life. So if you're interested in doing dope shit like that, come to Lehman College, because you can take awesome classes like that under Dr. Brad Schoenfeld or Dr. Mike Israel, right? But the impetus for that was exactly that. We were in a class, and the goal was to write a meta-analysis. We all proposed our ideas, and none of them really cut the mustard, as far as some of them didn't have enough research. Some of them just weren't super relevant to the things that we were interested in as a right? Or some of them had already just been covered in full, right? So originally I was like, let's do one on BFR. There's so many BFR studies. I was like, yeah, there's so many BFR studies that there are also so many meta-analyses looking at BFR. Right? So ultimately, Brad was the one that was like, you know what, drop sites don't have a good meta-analysis. Let's do that. So he was the idea was his, and I claimed it to be. I just kind of somewhat took the lead as far as the majority of the writing was concerned. Right? That was the.
So let's before we dive into it, yeah, let's define what a drop set is, how you were looking at that from a research perspective, and then we can kind of dive into some of the findings and how you collected that data.
Yeah, so the impetus on top of it just being a class is that drop sets are a really common practice amongst a bunch of different people. Like one bodybuilders for a very, very long time have been using intensity techniques like drop sets, right? There's also just something that bros do, like you have a run where you're just doing raises from the 30s down to the 5s, right? It's just a common thing. But we wanted to kind of like systemize that and look at all the studies to see if, are these bros wasting their time doing something, or is it actually a really good idea? And so that was the drive. And then with respect to what a drop set is, right? It's just it's a technique where you would perform a set. Let's just use bicep curls here. You would do a set of dumbbell curls to close to failure, right? Let's say you're getting somewhere around 10 to 15 reps, and you're getting pretty close to failure on those 10 to 15 reps, right? Let's say you're doing it 20 minutes. You then drop the weight and without resting at all. So instead of resting for your 2 to 3 minutes in between sets, you just immediately put those 20-pound dumbbells down. You pick up 15, 17-pound dumbbells, whatever you have access to, and then you knock out as many more reps as you can until you again get close or to failure, right? And then you can do as many subsequent drops as you want. You can go 20, 15, 10, 5, 3, or you can just do one drop and call it a day. Right? There's not really a universal. Not only is there not a universal definition by which we do those in the community, like if you ask me what a drop set is, and you ask another gym bro what a gym drop set is, you're going to probably get somewhat different answers, right? But that's also the case within the literature. So there, like you said, there was 5 studies, and each one of them kind of had like a slightly different variation of how they went about doing a drop set, right? So there's not a universal definition for what those are, but what I just said kind of gives you a general idea of how they work, right? And ultimately, I can jump into kind of the methods and what we found if you want, or we can break that down if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation. I think it's interesting how many things are ubiquitous in the industry too that we don't actually have good definitions for, right? Whether it's intensity or what is failure or what is a drop set, right? So typically I'll define that as at least like a 20% breakdown in weight before going into the subsequent set. But again, it could be anything, right? I know people that do a 50% drop. There's people that do, just 10 pounds. So I think it's, or 10% rather. So I think it's interesting that there's no really universal definition, but that's why so much of this stuff in exercise science is so murky, right? Because there's no clear cut answers to any of these things. So papers like this are so important to really start clarifying some of those details. So tell us about the studies involved, and then what did you guys find, and how was it compared, right? Because we said traditional training. So what did that look like in this actual study?
Yep, absolutely. So the first thing you do when you write a meta-analysis is you go to the literature, right? You go and try and compile all of the studies that you can possibly find that have to do with the topic that you're interested in, right? And generally what you do is a priori. So prior to you actually collecting this data, you decide what should or should not be involved in your analyses, right? We decided that we were only going to compare studies. We're only going to use studies that compared traditional training, right? Which is just you do a set, you rest 2 to 3 minutes, you do another set, you rest 2 to 3 minutes, you do another set. Only using studies that compare that to a group doing drop sets of some kind. And they had to measure directly hypertrophy or some measure of strength, right? So we were looking at the muscular adaptations both with respect to muscle size and muscle strength, right? So if a study had those two things involved, then we were able to measure it directly. There was a couple of studies that were comparing those two, so the traditional sets to drop sets, but they maybe used an indirect measure of hypertrophy, so like something like lean tissue on a DEXA scan or something like that, not a direct measure. So that was what was decided on as far as if a study was going to be included. So like we said, only 5 inclusion, right? And of those 5, you compile it all together, and we found that there's basically no difference whatsoever. Now, there's a couple of caveats to that. With respect to hypertrophy, there was no difference whatsoever, and I think that that's a pretty safe thing to assume. Assuming that you're getting relatively close to the same amount of volume and you're approaching failure kind of a similar number of times, you're probably good to be using drop sets as a primary method of training. Right now, again, more caveats to that I'm sure we'll get into. However, with respect to strength, no difference at all, right? Statistically, no difference at all. However, a lot of the loads that were being used in the traditional training groups were kind of in that 10 to 20 range, right? So things that you wouldn't expect to see large improvements in strength regardless. And the same could be said with drop sets, right? So if those studies were comparing individuals doing drop sets to maybe stuff like in that 3 to 6 range, I bet we see a larger difference. And in fact, I don't have to postulate that at all, because one of those studies, I think it was some of the Japanese studies, they compared drop sets to high load and low load training. And the high load training, those that were doing, I think, closer to that like 5 number, they actually did see better strength improvements, right? And then conversely, there was another study that we didn't use their strength measurements because the strength measurement they used was a 12 RM. So strength technically didn't count for us because it wasn't in that like basic strength range 1 to 3. But in that study, they actually did see pretty substantial improvements in the traditional training group for strength than in the drop set training group, which I thought was interesting. So even though our studies didn't say that strength was improved, these caveats are noted in the discussion. Don't get me wrong. I would say that it's probably not a good idea if you're interested in maximizing strength to use drop sets as your primary mode of training. Now, one last thing I'll say before we start breaking that down is that another thing that they measured that we didn't really think of until after we conducted the paper is that there's I think 2 or 3 studies that showed no difference in muscle growth whatsoever, but those in the drop set training group were training with less than half the time. So it was a much more time efficient way of training for those individuals in the course of the study, right? Okay, throw a lot at you there, so we can break some of that down.
Yeah, no, I think that was great and a lot to take away there. I think, again, it all sort of makes intuitive sense. When you talk about the volume equated, is that literally every drop set counted as another set versus the total sets with the appropriate rest?
I wish I could give you a straight answer on that, because the way that they volume equated in those studies was different. So like some,
Gotcha.
they would literally cut them off if they reached a certain rep number, because they'd be like, okay, you've reached the volume equation that those people in the traditional did, so stop. So unfortunately, no, volume wasn't equated like equally. Volume was not equated equally between all of the studies. So there's not really a good way of quantifying that, unfortunately. And I've heard a bunch of different good ones, like, you do your first set, that's one set, and then each subsequent drop set is a 0.5 set, right? Dr. Milo Wolf, he proposed one in his recent YouTube video. I thought it was pretty interesting. He said, whatever number of drops you do, subtract 1, that's the number of sets that you do. I actually thought that was a pretty interesting way of tracking it. But I don't have a direct answer for how you should go about tracking the number of sets you do.
And that's fine. And honestly, that sort of makes sense to me, because one of the things that frustrates me the most about exercise science literature is the fact that we do need to volume equate in most studies in order to have an apples to apples comparison. And the reality is there's not an apples to apples comparison, right? Like if you've run the rack, like you said, and gone from 30s down to 5s for bicep curls and taken every one of those sets to a 1 RIR or even to total failure, like there's no way to equate that with 3 to 5 sets of just a regular set of bicep curls, stopping 2 to 3 reps short of failure. So that to me is not a negative that they can't equally equate. And honestly, I wish there was a better scientific way to say, like, And maybe people just need to say, hey, we didn't volume equate in this, but it seems like that would sort of get thrown out in the community if you don't at least attempt to volume equate studies, which seems kind of unfortunate. And the strength piece, to me, it totally makes sense too, right? Because we know strength is very specific, right? So it would make sense that if you're doing more sets in that, 1 to 3, 3 to 5 sort of range, versus starting with a single set in that range and then breaking it down, that you'd be more specific in those adaptations. So nothing too crazy there. I think the biggest thing for me is the time piece, right? And this is what I try to harp on with people is, if you don't have time, drop set training, some other advanced techniques, rest pauses, which you guys obviously didn't investigate in this paper, but similar strategies to really maximize your time efficient workouts. What kind of differences were we talking about? Maybe I missed it here, as far as like total time commitment from the drop sets compared to the traditional training groups.
Yeah, so I can't remember it perfectly because like you said, the last time we talked was like a year ago, and I wrote that paper a year before we had that conversation or something.
No worries, but if you have a rough idea.
Yeah. So I do. I think there was, I believe, 2 of the studies that measured time. So 2 of the 5 actually measured time, which is unfortunate. I wish all of them had. So see. But I do think it was less than half the time. So it was either half or less than half of the amount of time that these individuals were spending in the gym when using drop set training with the same muscle growth, which is a pretty important thing to remember here. So yeah, like cutting your workout time in half and getting the same amount of growth. Now, do I think that that's always going to play out? I'm not sure, and I have a couple of reasons as to why. But that is at least what the paper found, is that these people were getting the same amount of muscle growth in literally half the time. But remember, that's only 2 of the 5 studies, so we can't say about that. We can't say that about all the studies that were.
Yeah, and taking a grain of salt with basically any research paper, which is only looking at 4 to 8 weeks, typically maybe 12 on the high end of growth, right? So you can take those changes that you see over that time frame, and unfortunately can't extrapolate those out for an entire training career, right? But I think the important piece with drop set training is that time efficient piece, right? And like you said, there's a huge abundance of evidence that's coming out that maybe higher volume is better if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy. And I think it's hard to debate that at this point. To me, though, it just comes back to this conversation that I've had with multiple people on the podcast so far, which is this idea of optimization versus sufficiency, right? Do you want to optimize muscle growth? Well, great. Go do 52 sets of leg extensions and squats or whatever that paper was. Do you just want to look better and feel better and get close to your genetic potential in the least amount of time possible? Well, cool. There's a great solution for that too, and it's drop sets, or it's full body training, or it's minimum effective dose. Exactly. Yep, exactly. So no,
I think it's important when you're talking about optimality versus sufficiency, right? There is gray area between those 2 things, right? And I know that you're not saying that there isn't, but it's important to remember that suboptimal can mean 98%. Right? Suboptimal can mean that you are getting the vast majority of the benefits that you were going to get had you put in 80% more work, right? And we don't know what that number is. We don't know if you get 80% of the gains you were supposed to get just going in the gym and doing 10 sets per week. And if you did maybe 30, you would only get 20% more growth. We don't know that relationship yet. It does seem to be logarithmic or asymptotic, where each additional set after 10, 20, 30 is giving you less benefits than after 5, 6, 7, if that makes sense. But we just don't know when it stops. And even if after the 50th set you're doing, if you add 2 more and they're giving you incrementally more and more gains, if your life depends on it, and meaning like if you care way too much about this like you and I do, then yeah, maybe it is actually worth doing that. But I do agree that most people aren't chasing optimal, and even those that are, it's important to note that suboptimal does not mean that or 50% even.
I think that's a great point, and it goes back to the study period timeline too, which is a conversation I don't hear people having nearly enough in the community of the volume debate. Is okay, 52 sets, and I just keep using this paper because it's so popular now to talk about on social media. But 52 sets of quads between squats and leg extensions is great for 4 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever the study period was. Are you going to do that for your entire life? Right now, if you're getting 80% of the gains, but you're doing that consistently for 20 years, are you going to get as close as you would have if you did twice, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times the volume over the course of 10 years? Well, okay. I mean, if you're getting there, right? If it's an all roads lead to Rome approach, which to me, the longer I've been in this, the more I feel like if you're training with a high level of intensity of effort and consistently over a long period of time, it seems like all roads do lead to Rome. It's just you might not be the emperor, right? If that's your goal is, being Caesar, and that's squeaking out every last piece of optimization that you possibly can. Well, you can still be part of the greatest city ever constructed. This is a terrible analogy. I just keep going with the Rome thing, but you get what I'm saying here, right? So to me, it really just comes down to what do you value? What are you trying to get out of your training? And I think that's an important conversation for people that aren't like us, like you said, that nerd out about this stuff and the nuances of everything, because the idea of training 52 sets a week for somebody who's never trained before can be
one muscle group.
Yeah, for one muscle group can be pretty freaking daunting, just from a time commitment perspective. So any other aha moments for you from this study before we drop into our next one here?
Yeah, so it's funny you keep bringing up the 52 set one. The 52 set one was done by I never know Eanes et al. Or Ines et al. ENES et al. Which is actually, he was involved on the drop set paper as well. And unfortunately, I can't remember if it was his or Fink's paper that lasted 12 weeks, right? That's a substantial amount of time to be doing only drop sets, right? So can that be extrapolated over a training career? I have no idea. But we know that it at least works in a 3-month block and at least for the same amount of growth. I mean, that's a substantial amount of time for something to supposedly stop working, right? And the last thing that I'll say about drop sets before we move on is that while, yes, our study did show that it is possible to get these same gains in a shorter period of time, that is assuming that you are training really hard, really hard, and pushing yourself very close to failure. Remember that these people that were doing these drop sets had, at the very least, one research assistant behind them screaming at them to do more, right? And I find that when I work with clients, it's pretty hard to get them to push super close to failure on drop sets, right? It's super super painful, and it's kind of similar to like higher rep sets where, is it really the muscle itself that's causing you to fail? Is it an inability to contract that muscle, or is it that shit hurts and you just are done with the set and you just want to stop? So if you are someone who wants to use drop sets, just keep in mind that you got to push pretty hard on them, and you got to be sure and be honest with yourself that you're actually going to failure because of the muscle, not because you are exhausted and tired of doing that set anymore. So that's the last little caveat I'll say about that.
That's a great point. And something else I just want to add on there too is I think that's why working with a coach, somebody that has experience in this, can be so valuable, right? Because if you're trying to implement drop sets in your training, the thing I always find beneficial is those smaller breakdowns versus the larger ones, right? For that exact reason you just mentioned, because we know when it comes to RIR, when it comes to getting to failure, the heavier the weight is, the better we are at actually approaching it, even with advanced trainees. So if you go from, let's use the bicep curl example again, right? From 30 pounds to 10 pounds, you're probably going to give up because of the burn, not because of going to failure, right? Whereas if you go from 30 to 25, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to actually approach failure again, as opposed to just, holy shit, this hurts so bad, I just want to stop, right? So keeping that in mind when it comes to drop sets too, I think is super important. Let's jump into this next paper that is in preprint. The last time I talked to you, you guys were just starting doing the research on some of this, or maybe even doing just the a priori kind of research there. But talk to us a little bit about this Deload study that's in preprint, that's coming out. It's gaining more from doing less. It is the longest title of any research paper I think I've ever seen. So I'm just going to say gaining more from doing less, and then you can tell us a little bit about it. Why don't you define Deloads for us, and then just talk to us a little bit about this study and the study design.
Yeah, so funny enough, at the time of starting at the conception of the idea for me to do this as my thesis, there wasn't a definition. So similar to drop sets, how if you ask a bro what a deload is, and you ask another bro, you're gonna get 3 different answers from the two of them, right? And the same can be said for the literature. Even within the data that we have, there wasn't any clear-cut evidence for what a deload was. Fortunately, whilst carrying out data collection for my study, I had the honor and pleasure of getting to work with Lee Bell and David Nolan and Dr. Pack on another study where we were actually creating a universal taxonomy for what a deload was. We were creating a definition for a deload in the literature. Right? And we did that through a series of interviews through coaches. I wasn't involved on the interview study, but then we had a Delphi study where we sent out a bunch of questionnaires to a bunch of different high-level coaches and athletes in the field and basically said, do you agree with this? And then if a certain number of people did, and we ultimately came up with a definition. Long-winded, sorry.
So funny side note on that, we published an episode from that study with PAC, and people obviously were in America, right? So people are so sensitive that I had multiple people. I just named the title of the podcast, the title of the article, which is "You Can't Shoot Another Bullet Without Reloading the Gun," and people lost their fucking minds about, oh my God, this is so insensitive. It's like, it's a euphemism. What are you talking about? Anyways, continue, please.
What a great name for a study too, right?
Like great name.
99% of all studies in this field are like the effects of long muscle length training on muscular hypertrophy of the biceps brachii. Like, you can't shoot another bullet until you reload it. That is the coolest. And I'm glad that we're seeing like our field is moving towards actually interesting title names instead of the efficacy of insert thing, right? So yeah,
definitely.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. So ultimately, that is all to say that we kind of synthesized, and I'm sure I'm going to watch it because I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically, a deload is a period of reduced training volume and or intensity with the intention of, I believe, reducing fatigue and improving subsequent adaptations in future training cycles. I could be so wrong, and that could not at all be what the actual definition is, but it gets you a general idea.
That sounded pretty good. Yeah, that's
it gives you a general idea of what a deload is, right? So the impetus for this study, right? Not only was there not a definition in the literature for what a deload was, but there was not really any study that had ever been done looking at deloads in the way that they're kind of commonly done in the field of exercise science, right? Not only was there not a lot of data on the topic in general, but there's also just a litany of people on social media talking about and proselytizing the benefits of deloading, right? Talking about yes, guaranteed it's going to lead to better gains in subsequent training cycles, like you're reducing all this fatigue that's allowing you to express more fitness, right? And it's not completely unfounded, those claims, right? So it's very clear in tapering literature that taking a period of reduced training volume and intensity is going to lead to better performance, right? That's almost unquestionable. However, there was and there's also some mechanistic things to suggest that you do see shifts to more type 2, like growth prone fibers, muscle fibers after periods of detraining. You do see reductions in cortisol. You do see rephosphorylation of mTOR pathways, all that stuff, right? But all mechanistic, right? And nothing longitudinal that actually tracked growth of a muscle over time, right? Except we did have 2 studies from Ogasawara et al. Out of Japan. They're doing a bunch of great work out of Japan. Shout out the kinesiology field out there. But they took individuals and placed them into either continuous training groups or periodic training groups where they took 6-week blocks and then separated them out by 3-week periods of detraining. And one of these studies lasted 6 months. So we were just talking about 12 weeks is a considerable study. So 6 months that's a big boy. And they found that you didn't find statistically significant differences between these groups, but those that were continuously training actually saw like slightly better growth in both size and strength, right? So that kind of put into question the possibility of like maybe deloads aren't that great, but 3 weeks of detraining is a lot different than 1 week of reduced training volume, right? So that was ultimately what pushed me to want to do my thesis on deloads. We can that's a little bit further. I can keep going into what we actually.
So that was 3 weeks total over the course of this 6-month time block. Was that broken into?
No, it was 2. I think it was 6 weeks total. 2 3-week blocks. It was 6 weeks training, 3-week block, 6 weeks training, 3-week block.
Got it. Over the course of 6. Yeah, that seems like a lot of time to take off as well. But you talked about some of the tapering literature and some of these other things. I think this is where ideas like periodization gain ground and sort of
absolutely
have stayed clinging on for so long because you tie that into this period of rejuvenation and recovery, which seems so logical, right? Especially when you look at what is periodization actually built for. Well, it's high level Olympic athletes originally, right? People who are doing enormous, ungodly amounts of volume, right? With their training, especially Russians, right, in the 1950s and 60s, especially taking performance enhancing drugs. Like, it makes sense that taking a period of recovery would lead to better performance outcomes, right? So when you extrapolate that down to the average trainee, it's interesting to see what does a week off actually do for you. So I'd love to hear more about your study setup and what that actually looked like. And I'm sensitive to your time. How long can you go over here?
So I've probably got another 17 minutes. I'll probably need to go around 1:15.
Perfect.
So,
Like
so we can definitely finish this up. Yeah,
perfect.
Sure.
Yeah, let's do it. Awesome.
Yeah. So with respect to the methods, correct? Like what we actually did.
With the methods for your particular study design, what were you guys looking at? What did the time frame of the study look like? All that stuff. Yep.
So ours was not 6 months long, unfortunately. Ours was 9 weeks long. We started with 50 individuals. You always lose people because we're essentially torturing these people for 9 weeks straight. So we ended up with 39 individuals. Comparing, and all we did was one group trained for the entire 9 weeks, and one group trained for 4 weeks, took 1 week off in the middle, and trained for 4 more weeks. And they were both doing the exact same workouts, which was 5 sets in the 8 to 12 rep range to all-out failure twice a week in the following exercises: Smith machine squats, leg extensions, bent leg calf raises, and straight leg calf raises, right? And then we also gave them an upper body program that was very similar. It was 5 sets, like in the 8 to 12 to failure, like shoulder press, bench press, normal upper
Were they
body
doing
program.
that on their own?
They were doing that on their own, but they sent me workout logs to ensure that they were actually adhering to the upper body program. Right? And if they didn't, they ultimately for the study. No differences whatsoever with respect to like what they were doing aside from the 1 week off in the middle, right? And we measured muscle size, muscle strength through ultrasound. We measured strength in both of the dynamometry, so a blind X dynamometer where you're locking someone into a position symmetrically, but also just a 1 RM Smith machine squat, right? So normal stuff. And then we also tested some other stuff that no one cares about. But we also tested, thank you to Dr. Pack, this kind of like subjective feelings towards training, right? It's called a readiness to train questionnaire. And we took that at the end of week 4 and the end of week 9. So the other measurements like size and strength, beginning and end of the study, right? That's straightforward. But the kind of perceptions towards training, your perception of your own fatigue, right? You're asking questions that you would normally ask an athlete before a deload. How strong are you feeling? Like, what was your sleep like? How do you feel mentally? You know, like, how was your appetite today? Stuff like that, right? And after the end of the study, right, after the 9 weeks, we saw basically no differences whatsoever in hypertrophy. You know, taking that 1 week off in the middle did not lead to any reduced gains, but it also didn't potentiate any better growth in the subsequent 4 weeks, right? Strength, on the other hand, took a pretty big hit in those that were detraining. So that 1 week off actually led to, they still got stronger, but they didn't increase their strength nearly to the degree that those in the continuous training did, suggesting that maybe a full week of detraining, if you're interested in maximizing strength adaptations, it's probably not a wise idea, right? And the most interesting.
What kind of percentage difference? Sorry to cut you off. What kind of percentage difference, if you remember, are we talking about from overall strength increases?
I can't give. Well, one, we wouldn't have reported as a percentage then, so we wouldn't have reported as because we used Bayesian statistics, and we would just kind of. And I can't remember. But it was like it was a substantial difference between the amount that they gained. Unfortunately, I don't remember off the top.
It's okay. Statistically significant, though. That's important to know.
That's statistically, again, Bayesian, so it's not frequentist, but it's the same thing. It was semantics. But the most interesting thing that we found from that study by far, and this was thanks to Dr. Pack again, because it was his idea to do the readiness to train questionnaire, right? Is that those in the detraining group, right, those that took a deload in the middle of the break actually saw a decrease in motivation from week 4 to week 9. And those that trained continuously didn't change. They were just equally as motivated at the middle that they were at the end. But seemingly, there was something about taking a break in the middle. We don't know if that's exactly why, maybe it's due to chance, who knows? But there was something about taking a break in the middle that ultimately led to a decrease in motivation for those in the detraining group, right? And then on top of that, they actually saw an increase in muscle soreness, right? So muscle soreness decreased from week 4 to week 9 in those that trained continuously, which makes sense. That would be the effect, right? But those that took a deload actually were more sore at the end of week 9 than those that trained continuously, right? So just another interesting finding from the study, in my opinion.
That is super interesting because in my personal anecdotal experience, I've found that people enjoy taking a little time off, whether it's having vacation, whatever, even personally, right? I feel a little more invigorated to go back to the gym after I've been away for a variety of different reasons. But I wonder if that would be a universal thing, because these were trained individuals, correct?
Yeah. So that's a really good point, and something I should have said earlier. So these individuals, in order to be included in a study, you had to have been training for at least a year. You had to have been lifting for at least a year consistently, right? We had some people that had been lifting for just 1 year, and then we had some people that had been lifting for 15 years, right? But the average training age for all of the subjects in the study was 4 years. So, relatively intermediate trainees on average, right? Now, with respect to what you just said about universality, right? Would that be universal? Because I also find that I really enjoy that week away and get really, invigorated to go train again. It's a really good feeling. But you and I are in this evidence-based world where for the last 5 years or so, people have been talking about how good deloads are for muscle growth and muscle strength, right? So maybe there's something there because to us, placeboing ourselves into thinking that there was something good about taking that week off. Whereas most people are not in this world at all. Even the people that are in my studies, right? They're not weirdos like me. They have lives. They just like to lift like normal people, right? So when you tell them to take a week off, bells and whistles is kind of weird. Why am I taking a week off? Because you're not telling them it's a deload. It's going to make you improve your gains a ton. You just tell them you're taking a week off, right? So maybe if there was a bunch of Logan Harreleys and Max Colemans in this study, we would see a difference with respect to their psychology or their perception of what that deload did. But because they're a bunch of normal people, it's possible that they viewed that week off as a negative thing, and that ultimately led to a decrease in motivation. This is all conjecture.
I wonder if you still have the data, or if you guys, obviously you still have the data, but if you looked at the correlation between their time training, right? Like their actual experience level and that decrease in motivation, was that a correlation that you noticed at all? Meaning, I would think based on what we just talked about and what you said there, that maybe people have been training longer might understand the importance of taking time away. Those people who've been training for 4+ years, were they less likely to be negatively affected by that deload mentally, if that makes sense?
So I can't speak to that because we didn't sub-analyze that. That would be a really interesting tool. It's actually something I thought. I was like, what if we looked at training age and see if that ultimately affected how a deload affected there? But because the idea, right, is that those that have been training longer, like people have a larger training age, a higher training age, or older training age, whatever it may be, are more likely to need deloads because it's easier for them to accrue a bunch of fatigue because they're lifting heavier weights on average. They're having to do more. Right. But we ultimately decided not to do that because it's possible that it would have led to more noise than signal. Right? So we ultimately did not do that, but I think it still would be worth sub-analyzing. And of course, we still have the data, so we could do that. But I can't give you a definitive answer. Yeah. Maybe one day. I want to break from deloads for a minute.
I can imagine. No, that would be interesting to see, though, and I'm sure this will not be the only study. It seems like every time something new comes up that people are just not copying it because we want more research in that particular field, right? But they're continuing to dive into that. So that might be an interesting sub-analysis down the road as we get more and more data. And hopefully people will think to do what the brilliant Dr. Pack did and ask those questionnaires, because I think that would be super interesting data set to look at. So I think takeaways for the average lifter, and please feel free to add in anything here, would be, it probably won't kill you to take a week off, right? It might physically feel a little bit worse, could potentially, decrease your strength gains. So think ahead, right? If you are a strength athlete, how to actually program specifically for that. But in that case, I would recommend maybe reading the "Don't Shoot Another Bullet Without Loading the Gun," right? Because talk a lot about the performance aspect in that paper with really, really high level coaches there as well. So if strength and power are your focus, then maybe read that paper first to kind of get some ideas, but it's probably not going to kill you to take a week off. And if you are, older in your training age and you're feeling burnt out, it's probably not the worst idea to do it, right? Take a little time away. That might be more anecdotal, right? But feeling more invigorated to come back, it's probably not the worst thing in the world. Any other big takeaways for you from this paper or doing this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So my biggest takeaway is what you just said. Like if you're someone who is, your elbow hurts, your kids have a bunch of stuff going on this weekend with like PTA meetings, you're going on vacation with your fiance for a week, like do not worry that all the muscles going to fall off your bone. Like we have clear evidence now that that's not the case, not just from my study, but from a bunch of other ones as well, right? That Ogasawara paper, those people were doing 75% of the work of the people that trained for the entire 6 months, right? And they saw basically the same gains, right? So don't be afraid if you're going on vacation, right? And on the other hand, don't assume that, and look, this is just one study. I can't speak to how deloads are even usually done because deloads are commonly done by taking a week completely away from the gym, right? But with the evidence that we currently have, I don't think that we can confidently make the assumption that taking deloads is going to lead to better gains in subsequent training cycles. And be honest with yourself. If you really need a deloader, right? Because we were putting these people through hell. I mean, this was not like ridiculous training, but I mean, it was 20 sets of quads a week to all out failure, right? So nothing small, right? And even the continuous training group after 9 weeks of training, we asked every single one of them when they came in for post testing, are you going to take a break from training for a little while? Like now that you've been training super hard for 9 weeks now, I'm super excited to start bench pressing again the way that I want to. I'm super excited to start training hamstrings again. Like, be honest with yourself. If you need a deload, take one. Don't be afraid that it's going to lead to muscle loss. But be honest with yourself. Do you need a deload or do you want to break from the gym? Right? Because they're two different things and they're both okay. But there's just no reason to think that there's anything magical about deloads with respect to future training cycles. So those are my big takeaways.
Yeah, and I think that's super important for anybody who's maybe listening that isn't a huge fan of going to the gym and does want to take some time away from time to time, but is worried about, I've worked so hard to gain what I have. I don't want to lose it. And I love having that conversation with people when they're like, I'm taking 3 days off to go on vacation. Like, I'm going to go back to zero, right? It's like, no, that's not how bodies work.
Weekend.
Yeah. So no, it's just encouraging to continue to see that research pile up there to say like, hey, you can take a little time off and it's probably not the end of the world, but really think about it hard if you do have strength goals, if you do have body composition goals, things like that might be more things to consider before you take those time periods away from the gym. So to recap here, because I'm sensitive to your time and I want to let you go, even though it's been great chatting with you. Drop sets, other advanced techniques, good, efficient way to sneak in a little more volume, maybe in a much more potentially time-effective manner. And I think these two topics really relate well to each other, right? You don't have time. You can use something like drop sets. You don't have time. You need to step away from the gym for a little bit. Hey, you can do that and feel confident coming back. So deload's probably not going to kill your gains, but also definitely not going to make you bigger and stronger and, some kind of super athlete when you come back. Anything else you feel like adding in this sort of synopsis here, Max?
No, I think that was beautiful. I don't think that we can confidently make the claim about deloads definitely not improving strength adaptations. I just don't think that the literature is there at this point to make those claims strongly. So, yeah, no, I think that was a beautiful synopsis, man. Well done.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Where can people find out more about you? We mentioned your Instagram. I believe it's Coleman et al. Are there any other socials you want to plug while you're here? Are you trying to take on clients virtually? Anything like that? Feel free to just promote yourself here for a sec.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a trainer out of NYC, an independent trainer out of NYC. So if you are interested in New York-based personal training, obviously reach out to me through Instagram, which I'm sure we'll link in show notes. And if you're like a true nerd, or if you're just interested in coaching for that as well, you can reach out to me on Instagram. But if you're a true nerd, like Logan and myself, I'm on ResearchGate as just Max Coleman. I'll come up immediately. That's if you're just dying to see the research that we're doing and you don't want to wait for science communicators like Logan to tell you what we did. That's where you can find me as well.
Yeah, and definitely all the research that's coming out of Lehman is very approachable compared to a lot of other research. It's not like it's any worse for wear. I just think that they do a really good job there trying to make it approachable for readers that maybe aren't so scientifically inclined, where a lot of other studies, it's like, Jesus Christ, this is like watching paint dry. So Max, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, man. And I'm so excited to see what the future holds for you. And thank you everyone for listening to Exercise is Bullshit. We will see you again next week.